The wind howled down from the high ridge, dragging snow in wide sheets across the clearing. Elliot Crane stood alone in the falling dusk, his breath puffing out in smoky clouds as he adjusted the scarf at his neck. Winter had come early to Pine Hollow that year, and the lake, usually rippling well into November, had already crusted over with ice. He could hear it moaning faintly under the weight of the snow, a long, sad groan that echoed through the pine trees like a warning. He turned back toward the cabin, a squat structure of dark timber and stone, weathered by time and frost. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. He had no visitors. Not anymore. The bear tracks had appeared 4 days ago. They started just beyond the edge of the frozen vegetable garden, deep prints in the snow, unnaturally precise for how heavy the animal must have been. No human could have made them. The tracks circled the cabin once, then vanished into the trees behind the shed. There were no signs of aggression, no scratches on the door or claw marks on the logs. Just the quiet print of paws and an eerie sense of being watched. Elliot had lived in the mountains for 23 years. He wasn't afraid of bears. He respected them. But this was different. He placed the wooden bowl of leftover stew out on the porch anyway. He hadn't always lived this way. Once, he had been a man of numbers, an insurance auditor in Portland, shuffling files and answering phones. That life ended slowly, and then all at once, when Helen died. Her absence cracked something in him, a silence that filled rooms. Within 2 months, he'd sold the house, packed up the Subaru, and driven north until the roads ran out and he could go no farther. That was 17 winters ago. Since then, his life had settled into routine, chopping wood, mending roofs, walking miles for supplies, and coming home to books, black coffee, and an old record player that mostly worked. People in town, what few were left, called him a bear man, more as a joke than insult. He'd nod and tip his hat, a half-smile in return, and keep moving. But now something was truly watching him. On the 5th day, the bear arrived. Not loudly, not with the crashing through trees he expected, but slowly, carefully, almost respectfully. Elliot was sitting on the porch, wrapped in his father's old wool coat, watching the clouds roll low when he saw it. First the head, rising from behind the woodpile. Then the heavy shoulders, the broad, lumbering step. A cinnamon-brown bear, female by the look of her, large, but not massive, with alert ears and a thin scar over one eye. Her fur was mottled with ice. She stepped into view as though she'd been here 1,000 times before. Elliot didn't move. The bear paused 10 feet away, nose twitching, and lowered her head toward the bowl. She sniffed once. Twice. Then, with surprising delicacy, she licked the remaining stew from the wood and sat down heavily in the snow. They sat in silence for a long time. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest. Not from fear, not really, but from something deeper. Reverence, maybe. As if he were being measured. The bear watched him, dark eyes unreadable, then rose and turned back into the woods without a sound. She came again the next night. It became a ritual. Elliot began setting aside scraps of food. Not much, a few roasted potatoes, half a rabbit, a crust of bread. Every evening, just before sunset, he would place the bowl on the porch and wait. Sometimes the bear came. Sometimes she didn't. But he always left the bowl out. By the 2nd week, she stayed longer. Once, she lay down just 10 feet away, her breath rising in slow clouds. Her ears flicked when he coughed. Another time, he spoke aloud, nothing grand, just a soft, cold night, isn't it? And she huffed in what almost felt like reply. He began calling her Marla. It came to him one night in a dream, Helen's middle name. He told himself it was just a bear. That he was old and lonely. That assigning names to wild animals was dangerous. But he said it anyway, when she came. "Good evening, Marla," he'd whisper, and she would blink slowly, never turning away. Snow deepened. The world shrank to a radius of miles, and the sky hung low and gray. Elliot's back ached constantly now. His hands were slower to respond. One morning, he dropped the axe mid-swing and stood staring at it for a full minute before stooping to pick it up. The bear's visits became the high point of his days. He wrote about her in his notebook. Drew her shape in the margins. Not for any audience, just so he could remember the way she sat, the way her fur caught the firelight from inside the cabin. One night, she brought 2 cubs. They were small, not more than 8 months old, little balls of fuzz that tumbled awkwardly behind her. Elliot froze as they clambered up onto the porch, sniffing and snorting. One of them knocked over the bowl. Marla gave a low grunt, and they retreated behind her legs. Elliot placed extra food the next day. In town, people muttered about a bear being too close. When he drove in for supplies, the owner of the general store, Dale, a man who wore 2 vests and smelled of pine, cornered him by the salt bags. "You know there's a sow roaming near the ridgeline, yeah?" Dale said. "Tracks everywhere." Elliot nodded. "She's not aggressive, yet. But if she's got cubs, that changes things." Elliot didn't answer. Dale leaned in. "You get rid of anything she's feeding on. She'll move on. Trust me, old-timer." He did not explain. There was no point. What would he say? "She comes to listen to me breathe? She's not a threat, she's a visitor." Instead, Elliot bought a second bag of flour, 2 jars of honey, and a bottle of aspirin. That night, he left the food under the old pine by the porch instead. Just in case. Marla came anyway. Spring threatened at last. The snow melted in patches. Sap ran in the trees. The cubs had grown fast. They played now, wrestling and climbing the logs by the edge of the clearing. Marla watched them with quiet vigilance. Elliot knew they would leave soon. One night, just before dawn, he stepped outside with his coffee and found her waiting. Just her, no cubs. She approached the steps. Not close enough to touch, but closer than she'd ever dared. He sat on the top stair, watching her breath rise and fall. For a long time, neither moved. "You'll be gone soon," he said softly. The bear blinked. Elliot's hands trembled. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe it was that after a lifetime of silence, he had finally found something, someone, who didn't ask him to be anything more than present. She lowered her head once, almost like a bow, then turned back toward the woods. He watched her vanish into the trees. She did not return for many weeks. The first snowfall came late that year. Elliot, now in his second winter at the cabin, watched from his window as the first lazy flakes wandered from a gray sky and dusted the clearing like a memory returning. It had been almost a full year since the bear last appeared, lumbering out of the forest at dusk, standing at a polite distance, then settling in near the firewood pile while Elliot laid out bread crusts and smoked trout. She had eaten quietly, without fear, then gone back to the dark trees without looking back. He hadn't expected her to come again. But on that afternoon, as the snow drifted gently across the clearing, he saw movement at the tree line, slow, wide, familiar. She was back. And this time, she was not alone. There were 2 small figures with her, cubs. Smaller, darker, and clumsier than she, they tumbled over one another in the snow until she gave a low grunt and they froze. She stepped forward a few paces and stopped. Elliot stood from his old chair by the wood stove and pressed a hand to the glass. He wasn't sure whether to smile or hold his breath. She had brought them to him, not close, not quite, but close enough to see. And that meant something. In the language of wilderness, it meant trust. He went to the pantry and pulled the same food he always did, smoked fish, stale bread, and the last of his summer apples. This time, he added a small handful of sweet oats and pumpkin seeds for the cubs, though he wasn't sure if bears ate such things. He stepped onto the porch slowly, boots crunching against frost-hardened planks. The bears didn't move. Only their eyes followed him. He laid the food at the edge of the porch, as he had last year, then stepped back inside. The cubs remained hidden behind their mother, snuffling softly in the snow. After some time, the big bear walked forward and began to eat. The cubs stayed put, watching. She finished quickly and turned back. This time, one of the cubs dared to follow her halfway to the food. She didn't stop him. He snatched an apple, nearly tripped over it, and scampered back. Elliot didn't sleep that night. Not really. He kept replaying the scene, the tiny paws in the snow, the big mother's quiet presence. He hadn't seen another human in months. The postman came by once in October, dropping off a box of winter socks and dried tea from Elliot's niece. Other than that, he was alone. Except now, maybe not quite. The next day, they came again. And the day after that. Over the next weeks, the routine became a rhythm. Elliot would prepare food every evening, laying it out by the porch as twilight settled. The bears would arrive in near silence, always cautious, always on edge, but each time a little more familiar. The cubs began to play in the snow while their mother ate. One day, one of them rolled right up to the porch step and bumped into a log, startled by the sudden closeness. It yelped and tumbled backward. Elliot laughed out loud, a rusty sound in the cold air. He started speaking aloud again, not to himself, but to them. Small comments, observations, even jokes. "You like apples better than fish, don't you?" he said one evening. The cubs were fighting over a half-frozen pear. Their mother looked up, eyes dark and ancient. Not afraid. Just present. The silence that winter wasn't empty anymore. It was full of watching. Of listening. Of waiting. Elliot found himself writing again, pages and pages in an old notebook he'd nearly thrown out. Not stories, not letters. Just fragments. Descriptions. Feelings. A kind of quiet reckoning. "I wonder if you remember me from last year," he wrote one night, glancing up from the table. "Or if it's just the food. Maybe that's enough." The storm came in mid-January, a brutal 3-day blizzard that buried the cabin to the windowsills and left the chimney clogged with ice. Elliot spent most of it shivering under blankets, his breath fogging in the bedroom. When it passed, the landscape was almost unrecognizable. The porch was gone, the path to the woods erased. He dug himself out slowly. First the door, then the porch, then the firewood stack. He was tired, more than usual. His arms ached in strange ways. Still, he went to the pantry and pulled together what he could. When he stepped out with the food basket, he saw no sign of them. No paw prints. No movement. Just snow and silence. He left the food anyway and stood for a while, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. That night, and the one after, he left food. Still nothing. on the third night, he didn't put anything out. He told himself it was pointless. The storm had driven them far, or worse. He sat at the window, watching the moon rise between skeletal branches. Then, movement. The big bear. Alone. She stepped from the trees like a ghost, slow and deliberate. Her coat was dusted with ice. She came all the way to the porch and sniffed the empty spot. Then she looked up, not at the food, not at the ground, but straight into the window. Straight at Elliot. He opened the door slowly, holding a blanket around his shoulders. The cold bit into his bones. She didn't move. "I'm sorry," he said, voice raw. "I thought. I wasn't sure." She stood a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the trees. Elliot didn't sleep again that night. He stoked the fire and sat in his chair, waiting for dawn. When it came, he dressed slowly and went outside with food. From that day on, she returned regularly, the cubs sometimes with her, sometimes not. The bond felt different now. Not deeper, not clearer, but older. Like it had moved into a quieter place. She no longer startled at every creak of the wood. She knew him now. By late February, Elliot was coughing more often. His hands trembled when he tried to write. He dismissed it as age, cold, isolation. But somewhere inside, he knew it was more. Something was shifting, something final. Still, he prepared the food each night. Still, he greeted the bears. Sometimes he spoke aloud. Sometimes he just sat quietly on the porch, listening to the snow melt and refreeze. And one night, one particularly clear and silent night, he didn't put out food. Instead, he stepped outside with only himself. He sat on the porch and waited. And she came. The cubs were gone. Grown, perhaps. Or elsewhere. She came alone and stopped a few feet from him. Elliot didn't speak. He only nodded, a slow, tired gesture, and looked at her. She looked back. For a long time, neither moved. Then she turned, not toward the woods, but toward the porch. One paw at a time, she stepped forward. Up the steps. Onto the planks. Closer. Elliot didn't move. She stopped just before him. Close enough that he could hear her breath. Close enough that he could see the scar along her left ear, one he hadn't noticed before. They stayed like that, in the quiet, until the stars began to fade behind the morning frost. And then she turned and left. Elliot didn't cry. Not that night. Not yet. But something had settled inside him, like the final stone in a path, or the last snowflake of the season. Snow fell heavier that year, as if the skies had something to say that the world had forgotten how to hear. Elliot's cabin, now barely distinguishable under layers of snowdrift, huddled like a memory buried under the weight of time. Inside, the old man's world grew smaller. His hands, once steady enough to whittle, trembled even holding a spoon. The fire took longer to start. The soup boiled slower. His cough lasted longer. But she still came. The bear. That brown blur of warmth and ancient muscle padded her way through the frostbitten trees, nearly invisible against the graying world. Sometimes alone, sometimes with her cubs nestled behind her legs, sometimes dragging her own weariness across the frozen earth just to reach him. They no longer feared each other, but neither did they speak. It was a sacred thing, the silence between them, rich, not empty. It held every lost word Elliot had ever spoken to the sky and every snarl the bear had swallowed in the wild. She would sit near the porch, and he would lean against the threshold, breathing shallowly, arms wrapped around an old wool blanket. He didn't always bring food now. Sometimes it was just his presence, and somehow that was still enough. In that quiet, Elliot began to feel something strange stir inside him, not happiness, but its weathered cousin, peace. It was different from the contentment he had known in his youth. It had the texture of surrender, but without the sting of defeat. One night, the wind screamed. The kind of wind that made trees kneel and shutters shake loose from their rusted hinges. Elliot had not expected her in that storm. He barely expected himself to make it through. But through a frost-blurred window, he saw her shadow, larger than life and wild against the white, pacing. Not running. Not hiding. Looking. He opened the door. The wind nearly took it off the hinges. "Come on, girl," he croaked, half laughing against the cold. She didn't enter. But she came close. So close that Elliot could hear her breathing. Her eyes met his. She wasn't afraid, but unsure. As if sensing something in him was breaking, and unsure whether to cross the threshold of his collapse. He sat down right there on the floor. Not out of dramatics, just out of sheer surrender. His body was no longer his, just a tired machine winding down. And then, she moved. A lumbering whisper through the blizzard, she came to the porch. Then closer. She didn't come inside, but she stepped into the lean-to beside the cabin, where old firewood and empty tin buckets lived. And there, she lay down. For the first time, she chose to stay the night. Elliot, breathless and light-headed, felt something shatter gently inside him. Not pain. Not even joy. Just something old being let go. He fell asleep beside the door. The next morning, the storm had stopped. The world wore a silence so absolute, it bordered on holy. When Elliot opened his eyes, he found her still there, asleep but alert in the way of mothers and hunted things. Her cubs nestled beside her, tiny and warm against her fur. She raised her head when he stirred, then lowered it again when she saw no danger. He didn't speak. He couldn't have, even if he wanted to. That day, he gave her the last jar of honey. He had been saving it, not for her, but for some imagined celebration. Perhaps he thought he'd survive this winter after all. But now he knew this was the celebration. When he opened the jar and placed it before her, she approached with reverence. No lunging. No growling. Just slow, deliberate movement, like a priest approaching the altar. She licked from the jar, slow and careful, her tongue as soft as moss on the lip of stone. Her cubs watched, then followed suit, dipping tiny paws and nibbling at the sticky sweetness with blinking innocence. Elliot chuckled, and it came out as a cough. That night, he wrote. Not much. Just a few lines in a notebook stained with smoke and time. She slept here tonight. I think she knows. I think she's staying because she understands something I can't say. He slept harder that night than he had in months. In his dreams, he was young again, not on some battlefield, not hauling timber, not burying his brother, but walking through a field of tall grass. And beside him, not a woman, not a man, but a great bear. And he wasn't afraid. He was free. The days blurred after that. Sometimes he'd wake and she would already be there. Other times, she would arrive after dark. But she always came. And the cubs grew bolder, nibbling at his boots, pawing at the edge of his coat. One even curled up beside him one afternoon, while the fire sputtered and old music whispered from a dusty radio. The bond, unspoken, had grown roots. But time, it has no mercy. One morning, Elliot could not rise. His eyes opened. His hands twitched. But his body was done. The final gears had slipped. He lay there, blanket up to his chest, breath shallow as melted snow. She came that morning too. But when she stepped onto the porch, something changed. She didn't sit. She didn't wait. She came to the door and, for the first time, let out a low, resonant growl. Not a threat, a call. Something between concern and insistence. He couldn't answer. And still, she waited. For hours. Then, slowly, she rose and padded around the cabin. She sniffed at the corners, touched her snout to the places where his scent lingered most. And finally, as the light faded into that amber hush that only comes in deep snow, she lay down against the wall of his cabin. That night, Elliot slipped away. Quietly. Like a final leaf falling from a long-wintered tree. And the bear, eyes closed, remained by the wall. She stayed there until morning. And the next. And the next. And then, she left, not alone, but with the cubs, now grown just enough to walk through the forest on their own strength. But each year after, when the snows began to fall, she returned. Even when no fire flickered. Even when no man's breath fogged the window. She came. And sat. As if keeping vigil not just for the man who had fed her, but for the bond that had defied every natural law. Predator and prey, wild and human, life and death. In the years to come, hikers would sometimes spot her, the old brown bear with gray at her muzzle, sitting by a cabin long empty, its door still crooked, a single wool blanket still folded by the threshold. And none of them understood. But she did. And maybe, somewhere, so did he. The winter of Elijah's 76th year arrived earlier than usual, blanketing the forest under feet of snow before the final leaves had even fallen. What little light pierced through the clouded skies in those weeks barely touched the forest floor. The world had turned gray, brittle, and silent. And so had Elijah. His steps were slower now. The ache in his knees no longer faded after morning coffee, and the tremor in his left hand, once barely noticeable, had grown strong enough to make writing a challenge. His journal entries shortened, his cursive devolving into shakier loops, but he still wrote every morning, even if only a few words. That season, he prepared the food for the bear with greater care. He roasted the root vegetables a little longer, added a touch more honey. He bundled the leftovers tighter, wrapping the meal in cloth and tucking it in the usual hollow near the pine where the bear had first approached him years ago. But something was different now. The bear no longer waited for the meals. She came earlier, sometimes catching him still kneeling with the bundle in hand. She'd pause, gaze steady, unafraid. There was a patience in her that mirrored his own. Sometimes, she brought the cubs. They were clumsy, curious things. One lighter in color, nearly cinnamon, and the other dark like her. They'd hang back at first, poking around snowdrifts, chasing snowflakes. But gradually, they inched closer to the man. The first time the darker cub sniffed his boot, Elijah didn't move. His body ached with cold, but he let the moment pass without breaking it. He stared down, quiet, tears in his eyes for reasons he didn't quite understand. "I'm not long for this, girl," he whispered to the mother bear, who stood just yards away, watching. "You'll need to teach them to feed without me." The bear said nothing, of course. But in her posture, alert, firm, yet not aggressive, there was something that felt like acknowledgement. A solemn nod only the wild could offer. The days passed with a fragile rhythm. Elijah did less chopping, more resting. He sat by the window more often, wrapped in his old woolen blanket, a mug of weak tea trembling in his hands. His breath fogged the glass as he watched the trail that led into the forest, watching for movement, for fur against the snow. Sometimes she came. Sometimes she didn't. On the days she did, Elijah's face would soften in a way that even time couldn't undo. He would shuffle to the back porch with what strength he had, placing the food gently at the spot worn smooth by years of offering. One morning, he didn't get out of bed. He had intended to, had even placed one foot on the cold wooden floor, but the rest of him refused to follow. His lungs burned, and his breath came like sandpaper dragged through his chest. The tea on the nightstand had long gone cold. The radio murmured in the background, static between violin notes. He didn't remember drifting into sleep, but he woke to the sound of the cubs outside, their whines high and soft, like puppies lost in the snow. He pulled himself to the window, gripping the ledge. Through the frosted glass, he saw them circling the pine hollow, sniffing around, puzzled. He wasn't there. The food wasn't there. And then she came, the mother. She emerged from between the trees, silent and slow, her breath fogging the air like smoke from a dying fire. She looked up toward the cabin, eyes locked on the window where Elijah stood. He raised a hand. It trembled, not from fear, but from everything else. She held his gaze. It felt like minutes passed. Then she turned back to the cubs, gently guiding them away from the hollow. She led them farther into the trees, vanishing from sight. That night, Elijah didn't sleep much. He was too cold, too restless. The silence inside his home had grown louder than any storm outside. He thought of letters he never sent. Of a brother he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Of a woman named Anna whose face he could barely remember but whose voice still lived in the attic of his mind, singing old hymns through the floorboards. He remembered her laugh and the way she used to tuck his scarf tighter around his neck when he left to gather wood. "You always forget the wind," she'd say. He remembered the day she died. He remembered not speaking for 3 days after. Not because he was grieving in silence, but because he was afraid of what would come out if he tried. He'd only started talking again when the bear first showed up. Maybe that's why he kept feeding her. Maybe he thought she was carrying a piece of Anna with her. Maybe that's why he never stopped. On the 3rd morning of his illness, the snow had piled so high against the cabin door that it barely opened. He pushed against it, coughing, weak but determined. He made it out with the last bundle, potatoes, bits of smoked salmon, and a handful of berries he had frozen months ago. He trudged to the pine hollow with labored breath and knelt to leave the offering. And as he did, she was already there. Waiting. She hadn't come from the trees this time. She was just there. Silent. Watching. The cubs stayed behind. Elijah looked up, tears streaming down his cheeks, freezing halfway. "I'm sorry," he rasped, voice thinner than frost. "This might be the last time." The bear stepped forward. He didn't move. She sniffed the bundle. Then she sniffed him, his shoulder, his arm, his face. And then, in a moment that felt sacred, she touched her forehead to his. Just once. He closed his eyes. There were no sounds in that moment, only the quiet falling of snow and the rhythm of 2 aging beings who had learned to trust across language and species and time. She turned, nudged the bundle aside with her paw, and left it untouched. Then she walked away. That night, Elijah collapsed beside the hearth. The firewood was nearly gone. His tea was water. His journal lay open to a page he hadn't finished. Only 3 words? She was here. The days grew shorter. Snow came early that year, blanketing the valley with thick silence. Every morning, the man would sit in his rocking chair by the window, wrapped in flannel and an old knitted shawl his late wife once wore, watching the edge of the forest. There was always the faint hope that the bear, or perhaps the cubs, would appear. His heart would quicken at any sign of movement, only to slow again when it turned out to be wind or birds or nothing at all. He was weaker now. His cough had grown deeper, as though it came from someplace below his ribs, someplace tired. He rarely went to the shed anymore. The buckets of dried corn and peanuts had to be dragged by a neighbor boy he paid in apple pie slices and stories. He didn't tell the boy who the food was for. "It's for the crows," he said once. The boy laughed. "Crows don't eat peanuts." "They do if you tell 'em nicely." But the boy asked fewer questions after that, happy to load the old sled with the feed and pull it to the same clearing near the tree-line every Wednesday. The man would watch from the porch. Sometimes, he'd bring the old harmonica out and play a few notes into the cold air. Not a song exactly, just a feeling. A sound like breath and time and patience. Then one morning, just as the pale sun peeked through the clouds, he saw her. The bear. She was larger than last season, broader around the shoulders. The thick ruff of fur around her neck made her look ancient, wise. She stood not far from the shed, sniffing the air. And beside her, barely visible at first, were the cubs. 2 of them. Small, round, cautious. They clung close to her, watching as she took slow steps toward the spot where the peanuts had been scattered. She looked once toward the house, then lowered her head and began to eat. The man didn't breathe. It was real. He pressed one hand to his chest. Not in fear, in awe. After all this time, she had returned. And not alone. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint crackle of the wood stove, thinking about her. She had come back with young. Did she trust him enough to show them? Was this her way of saying something? Offering something? Or was it just food and winter, and he was imagining the rest? He didn't care. The next morning, he made a pie. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit, maybe gratitude. But he chopped apples and rolled dough with shaking hands, humming the same tune his wife used to sing when they cooked together. By noon, the scent of cinnamon and butter filled the house. He cut 2 slices, one for himself, one he wrapped in wax paper. Then he walked out to the tree-line, every step deliberate, leaning on his cane. When he reached the old stump where he used to leave the corn, he placed the pie slice there. No movement in the woods, just silence and frost and sky. But something had changed. There were paw prints. Not just large ones, small ones too. Cub prints. Dozens of them, scattered and fresh, circling the stump. He bent carefully and traced one with his fingers. The pads had pressed deep into the snow, revealing weight and warmth. They had been here. And they'd be back. That night, he dreamed of bears. But in the dream, he was younger. He stood barefoot in the snow, and the bear stood upright beside him like an old friend. Her eyes were gold, and her voice, though not a voice at all, told him something in silence. You're part of the forest now. You've always been. When he woke, he didn't feel cold. Just still. Like he'd finally found the rhythm he'd been missing. Days passed. The visits became regular. The cubs would come first now, brave enough to sniff and paw at the food, while the mother watched from a distance. Sometimes she would approach, nudge them gently, or stand between them and a strange noise. She was a sentinel, a teacher. And the man? He became part of the ritual. He no longer needed the boy to help carry the food. He'd rise with the sun, tie his scarf tight, and pull the sled himself, slowly, but with purpose. His breath came harder, and he had to rest more often. But there was a new strength in him. Not physical, something else. A reason. One morning, while he stood near the stump, the larger of the two cubs approached him. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that their eyes met. It was a curious look. Not fear, not hunger, recognition. The way a child looks at someone who might tell a story. The man smiled and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a wooden charm, a tiny bear he had carved years ago, rough and uneven. He placed it on the stump beside the peanuts and stepped back. The cub approached, sniffed, and with a small sound, almost like a squeak, took the charm in its mouth and ran back to its sibling. The man didn't know why he cried. It wasn't sadness. Not quite joy either. Just a deep knowing that he'd given something that would be carried into the trees, into winter, into the world he would soon leave. His doctor came by 2 weeks later. The news was gentle, but final. "It's time," the doctor said. "You need to start thinking about the end. Pain management, comfort. Maybe a nurse." The man nodded, eyes drifting to the window. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets. "No bear today." "I've been thinking about the end," he said softly. "For a long time. But the forest isn't done with me yet." The doctor didn't understand. But she smiled anyway, squeezed his shoulder, and left. The snow that year seemed reluctant to leave. Even as April inched forward, it lingered in patches under the trees and along the edges of the north-facing slopes. The wind was tired but still sharp, and the man, now much thinner, his steps less sure, found it harder to gather the firewood that had once been a ritual of strength. He had never once complained in his life, not about the cold, the loneliness, or the pain that now lived quietly in his bones. But as he bent to pick up a fallen birch branch, a spasm in his chest made him freeze mid-motion. He leaned against the tree, breathing carefully, eyes shut. When he opened them again, he found her watching him. The bear. She was standing farther away than usual this time, not lounging near the woodpile or sniffing the half-eaten salmon he'd left out earlier. Her dark eyes didn't blink. Her cubs, a little bolder now, rounder, more curious, stood behind her. She didn't move forward. She just stood and stared at the man with an intensity he couldn't understand. The man exhaled, slow and ragged, and gave a faint wave. "I'm all right," he rasped, unsure if he meant it more for her or for himself. She didn't believe him. He could tell by the way she lowered her head just slightly, the way her ears twitched back, the way the cubs remained in place, watching. That night, sleep came late. The man lay in bed beneath his thick quilt, but warmth was a memory. The cabin walls creaked, whispering things he didn't want to hear. He felt the emptiness more than ever. The quiet wasn't kind anymore, it was observant, waiting. In the early morning hours, a soft noise stirred him. Not the wind. Not the creak of wood. A soft padding sound. He sat up. There, at the window, was her face. She didn't try to come inside. She simply looked at him, eyes dark and unreadable, breath fogging the glass. Behind her, in the faint dawn, the cubs waited a few paces back, half curious, half asleep. The man stood slowly, painfully, and crossed to the window. He didn't open it. Just raised a hand and touched the glass from the inside. You came back, he whispered. She huffed gently, fogging the pain again, and then turned away. The cubs trailed after her. The man didn't sleep again that morning. May arrived, and with it, a few timid flowers poking through the soil. The man had stopped chopping firewood. He now used what little remained in the shed. Each log he placed in the stove felt like lighting a piece of himself. The bear kept coming. Less frequently, but more deliberately. She never came too close unless he called to her, and even then, only once the cubs were settled safely. He noticed something new in her, a watchfulness, a restraint. As though she sensed the boundaries of time the same way he now did. One evening, after a warm day and a soft breeze, the man sat on the porch and watched the trees sway. The bear came, alone this time. No cubs. Just her. He didn't speak at first. Neither did she. He simply opened his palm, showing a handful of blueberries he'd saved from the last jar he canned years ago. She came forward, slowly, her breath thick in the early summer air. She sniffed the offering, then looked at him. Really looked. I don't have many left, the man said, his voice cracked and distant. But neither do I. The bear didn't take the berries. Instead, she lowered herself down beside the porch. She didn't eat, didn't beg, didn't move much at all. She just rested there, a quiet guardian in the dusk. The man leaned back in his chair. His bones ached less when he didn't fight the stillness. The following week, the man found a paw print on the path to his vegetable patch. Not one of hers. Smaller. A cub's. He smiled. They had returned on their own, testing their world now. He spent the next few days in memory. Every movement reminded him of what once was, how he'd climbed mountains in his youth, built this cabin by hand, survived winters that nearly broke lesser men. But none of it mattered now. His breaths came harder. His meals grew smaller. His world was shrinking. Still, she came. Sometimes with the cubs. Sometimes alone. Sometimes she brought things, a fish dragged from a distant stream. A chewed-up bone. Once, she even left what looked like a shiny rock on the porch. He didn't know what to make of it, but he kept it. It's more than most ever gave me, he murmured. One particularly cold night in June, the man collapsed while fetching water from the stream. He didn't scream. Didn't cry out. But he couldn't move. The pain in his chest felt like fire and ice, stabbing and freezing all at once. He lay there, his cheek against the soft earth, eyes clouded with the overhead stars. Then he heard the soft rustle of leaves. A low grunt. And warmth. She came to him, not cautiously, not from a distance. She came close. Right to his side. She nudged his arm gently, then more urgently. When he didn't move, she let out a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard from her, half growl, half moan. Almost a cry. Then she turned and lumbered back into the trees. The man blinked slowly. If this was the end, he was strangely okay with it. But minutes later, she returned, with her cubs behind her. One by one, they huddled near him. The warmth of their bodies closed in around him, and the wind seemed to pause. He didn't know how long they stayed like that. Only that he woke up in the morning, alive. He made it back to the cabin, barely. He left the door open that day, hoping she'd come. Not just to visit. To stay. That evening, she did. She came to the threshold, her cubs hesitating behind. He sat on the floor, too weak to rise. You can come in, he whispered. This place, it was always meant for more than one. She didn't enter. But she didn't leave. She stayed on the porch all night, curled near the open door, the cubs nestled beside her. Inside, the man slept the deepest he had in weeks. By the middle of July, the man stopped speaking entirely. His voice simply left him. He tried once or twice, but the words wouldn't rise. Still, he wrote. He scribbled notes in a notebook, little observations, final thoughts. One page read. She knows. I think she always did. Another said. We're not so different. Just two old creatures waiting out the last of the snow. And on the last page he filled. If I go, and she returns, let her remember I stayed. One morning, he didn't get up. She came as she always did. Sniffed the porch. Pawed gently at the doorframe. The cubs didn't follow that time. She stepped inside for the first time ever. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old quilts and the faintest trace of blueberries. She found him lying in his chair, a blanket over his lap, one hand still clutching the notebook. He didn't move. She didn't make a sound. She simply sat beside him for a long while. The sun moved slowly across the wooden floor. Outside, the wind passed gently through the trees. The winter deepened in quiet layers, and the forest drew inward, like a breath held too long. Snow blanketed the trails where men once walked and creatures once stirred. Now, the crunch of boots or crackle of firewood had faded, replaced by long silences punctuated only by the whisper of wind and the soft groan of trees under snow. Inside the cabin, Henry's world had grown smaller. What had once been his sanctuary, a humble wooden lodge nestled on the slope above the river, had become his horizon. He no longer rose with the sun, nor ventured to the porch. The woodpile, once his pride, sat untouched. When the fireplace died down, it was not stoked. When cold crept in, he no longer fought it. He often lay still, looking at the ceiling with glazed eyes, his mind adrift in soft memories. He remembered his first encounter with the bear, how young and foolish he'd been, armed with a rifle and fear. And how she, small and scrappy then, had stood her ground not with ferocity, but a sort of quiet question in her eyes. Will you hurt me, too? He hadn't. That moment had changed everything. Or perhaps, more truly, it had begun everything. Outside, the bear came less often now, and when she did, it was not alone. Her cubs, too this time, both round and curious, tagged behind, tumbling through snowdrifts and sniffing cautiously at the smells around the cabin. The old bear would sit at the edge of the clearing, never too close, but never too far. Watching. One morning, when a dull sun pressed itself weakly through thick clouds, Henry awoke with the odd sense of having overslept by years. His breath was shallow, and he could no longer lift himself from bed. Time passed in fragments. He saw shapes at the door, neighbors, perhaps, come to check in. But they were distant and quickly gone. The sounds around him began to seem like echoes from a dream he wasn't part of anymore. Still, he clung to the image of the bear. He wondered where she slept now, how large the cubs had grown. He hoped they would learn from her gentleness, her wariness, her ability to forgive. Then one afternoon, a sound unlike any other stirred him. It was not the wind, nor the snow falling from the eaves. It was heavier. Familiar. A step. The door creaked. Not open, not closed, just a creak, like the house exhaled a memory. And then, nothing. But Henry's eyes widened. He turned his head slowly toward the source, and for a long moment the silence grew thick. Then he saw her. Not in body, but in memory so vivid it pierced the veil of pain. She was there, not the lumbering bear of late years, nor the scrappy cub of old, but the creature who had watched him, year after year, across the threshold of fear and trust. Her eyes, dark as bark, met his once more. Tears welled, but they did not fall. He tried to speak, but the words never left his mouth. Instead, he reached weakly toward the air where she once stood. In the forest clearing, the bear stood still beneath the falling snow. Her cubs, restless, pawed at the snowbanks, but she did not move. She lifted her nose, scenting something on the wind. Something not of danger or prey, but of passing. She gave one long, low exhale. Then turned, and walked slowly toward the trees. Later that night, the light in Henry's window flickered for the last time. By morning, the snow had covered the footprints around the house, and all was still. The town did not know he had gone until 2 days later. When they found him, his room was quiet and warm, the fireplace having burned down to embers. On the small table beside his bed sat a chipped ceramic bowl, still filled with old berries and oats, his last offering. There were bear tracks outside, barely visible now, but unmistakable to those who looked closely. Word spread in the town. Some called it a coincidence. Others, especially those who remembered Henry's stories, believed different. They said she came to say goodbye. That she knew. Children left little bundles of dried fruit at the edge of the woods that week. One girl tied a red ribbon around a pine branch near his porch. Another boy, whose grandfather once shared the same logging trails as Henry, carved a bear into a flat piece of cedar and nailed it to a tree by the stream. In time, the cabin faded into quiet legend. The forest, as always, reclaimed what was hers. Roof caved, windows broke, but the bones of the house stood tall. Yet some winters, when the snow falls thick and soft, and the sky hangs low with old sorrow, hikers claim to see a great brown bear sitting near the remains of that porch. Not eating. Not moving. Just watching. And if you look closely, they say, you'll see she's not alone. The snow had grown deeper than in years past, swallowing the fences and creeping over the fallen logs like a quiet tide. The trees stood like frozen witnesses, their dark trunks streaked with white, and the wind moved through them in soft sighs, as though nature itself was holding its breath. Inside the cabin, the old man's world had shrunk to a single room and a view from a single window. The hospital bed had replaced the worn sofa, and oxygen tubes had taken the place of firewood stacked nearby. The fire still burned, always tended by a neighbor boy or by someone from the town, but it felt less like a source of warmth now, and more like a flickering echo of something that once was. He had stopped writing in the journal. The pages sat open beside him, and the pen lay diagonally across the entry where he had last recorded her visit. December 9th. The bear had returned, her 2 cubs in tow, pausing at the clearing's edge while he watched from the window. She didn't come to the porch that time. She just sat there, her eyes fixed on the house, her breath visible in soft puffs, the cubs huddled close. He'd whispered her name, not that he ever gave her one, but a name he'd thought of in his dreams, and in that whisper was both welcome and farewell. The days passed strangely after that. The man drifted in and out of sleep, not always sure if he was dreaming or remembering. Sometimes he woke with tears already sliding down the sides of his face. Other times, he smiled at shadows that spoke to him like old friends. One morning, as the wind howled and the temperature dropped dangerously low, the nurse from the clinic arrived with extra blankets. She was young and kind, her movements efficient but gentle, and she always brought with her the scent of cold air and peppermint tea. She sat beside him longer than usual that day, her eyes catching the corner of the journal. "You kept a log?" she asked softly, leafing through pages filled with years of entries. She smiled at the neat handwriting, the sketches in the margins, paws, trees, the outline of a bear's silhouette against the moon. "She came every year," he said, his voice like dried leaves. "Every winter." The nurse looked at him, eyes wide with something between wonder and disbelief. "A real bear?" He nodded. "Not just a bear." She understood. The nurse didn't laugh. She didn't scoff. She simply closed the journal gently and placed it back on the nightstand, tucking the pen inside. "Maybe she'll come again," she said. "For the last time." Later that night, the old man dreamed. Not the strange, drifting dreams of pain and memory, but a clear and vivid vision, so real he could feel the cold under his feet. He stood in the clearing again. Not sick. Not weak. Just a man with a full coat and a steaming mug of tea in his hands. Snow fell around him in delicate spirals, and before him, standing tall and silent, was the bear. She was older now, too. Her fur showed hints of silver along her back, and her eyes, those deep, amber eyes, held the weight of years and winters shared. She stepped forward, and he didn't flinch. She brushed her head gently against his shoulder. Her breath warmed his neck. He heard the creak of trees around them, the hush of falling snow, and the thudding heartbeat in his chest that somehow matched the rhythm of her own. "I'm not afraid," he said in the dream. "I'm ready." The bear didn't answer, of course. But she stayed there with him until the sky lightened and the world turned to mist. He woke up the next morning with frost on the inside of the window. The fire was out. The room was cold. And yet, he smiled. Out in the woods, the trail was covered, but not erased. The bear had passed through again. Neighbors would later say they'd seen large prints near the edge of the road, and one man claimed to have caught a glimpse of her just before dawn, standing still at the edge of the tree-line. She didn't come to the porch this time. She didn't eat from the bowl left under the overhang. But she came. Inside, the man had passed in his sleep. No struggle. No sound. Just stillness and a faint smile on his lips. The nurse found him the next morning, a quilt pulled up to his chest, and the journal, closed, but resting on the covers as if placed there by a gentle hand. News of his passing spread slowly. He had no children, no close family. But the town knew him. The man who fed the bear. The recluse who still wrote thank-you notes to the mailman and left jars of honey at the edge of his land for whoever might need them. Some people said he was crazy. Others called him a saint. But the children knew. They had grown up hearing the stories, how the bear came every year, how she had cubs, how she would sit near the porch and never harm a soul. So when the town decided to clean the property, to remove the bed and the boxes of books and the hand-carved wooden bowls, it was the children who protested. They wanted the cabin to stay. They wanted the trail to be marked. They wanted people to remember. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, stood up at the town meeting, her voice trembling but strong. He was her friend, she said. That's what the bear was. And she was his. That matters. The room fell silent, and even the oldest councilman, who had known war and hardship and too many winters, nodded slowly. Spring came, as it always did. Reluctantly. The snow began to melt, and the air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the cabin, the town placed a carved stone. Nothing elaborate. Just a simple monument etched with a pine tree and the silhouette of a bear. Beneath it, the words, "He fed her every winter." And in the end, she remembered. People visited. Some to take pictures, others to leave tokens, stones, feathers, poems on scraps of paper. One day, someone left a pot of honey. Another day, a small wooden bear carved by a child. And every so often, the prince would appear again. Wide, padded tracks moving quietly through the snow, pausing near the stone, then disappearing back into the trees. As if she still came to visit. As if the promise between them had never truly ended. The spring that followed Amos' passing was quiet. A hush had settled over the valley, not the stillness of death, but the pause of things listening. The cabin, once brimming with warmth from Amos' firewood and presence, now stood as a soft shell of memory. The smoke had stopped curling from its chimney. The trail that wound through the trees, so often broken by boot and paw, remained untouched, as if nature held its breath. For 3 days after the old man's funeral, no one dared walk the path to his land. The town respected what he had become in those final years, not the recluse they once whispered about, but a kind of guardian of solitude, of wildness. But on the 4th day, Jonah, the young mailman who'd once befriended Amos, took it upon himself to visit the cabin. The door, surprisingly, wasn't locked. Inside, he found only what was necessary: books, dried herbs, a kettle still holding the faint scent of chamomile, and an envelope on the table with his name written in unsteady script. Inside was a short note. "If they come, let them be. If they don't, let them be. But if she comes, stay back. This is not for us to manage. The forest remembers. Let it." Jonah folded the paper and stood quietly for a long time. He didn't step farther in. He left the note on the table, the door open behind him, and walked away with more questions than answers. That very evening, as twilight blanketed the valley, something stirred. The great brown bear, older now, her fur streaked with silver strands, emerged from the trees with her 2 cubs. She did not hesitate. She walked the trail as if it were hers by right, by memory. The cubs followed clumsily, not yet sure what this pilgrimage meant. She did not go to the feeding stump. She went to the cabin. The open door welcomed her, and she paused at the threshold. For one long minute, she stood still, the kind of stillness that only comes when all instincts, every heartbeat, leans into memory. Then she stepped inside. The cubs did not follow. They waited at the porch, sniffing the wood, climbing onto the bench where Amos once sat and smoked his pipe. Inside, the bear moved slowly, her heavy frame gliding across the floorboards with reverence. She pressed her nose to the floor where the old man's boots had worn a mark, sat on the rug he'd once offered her on cold days, and finally curled up in the corner, beside his empty chair. She stayed there the whole night. No one saw her leave, but by morning the only trace she had visited was the faint indentation of her weight on the rug, a single claw scratch on the arm of the chair, and the warmth still clinging to the room. From then on, she came every few weeks. Never long, never loud. She'd sit by the porch. She'd let her cubs sniff the woodpile. Sometimes she'd carry something in her mouth, a large pine cone, once a twisted piece of bark, and once, strangely, the jawbone of a deer, polished white by time. She'd leave them at the door. Gifts, perhaps. Or grief. In town, stories spread, but none of them were disrespectful. They were not the cruel stories of old, but gentler ones. The children would say, "The bear visits Amos." The elders, quietly sipping coffee at the diner, would add, "She remembers." And that was all. That summer, something unexpected happened. The ranger's office, which had once filed Amos as a potential threat for feeding wildlife, reversed its tone entirely. A young biologist named Tasha asked to study the phenomenon, not to disrupt it, but to understand it. She set up motion-sensitive cameras, hidden under brush and rock, never near the cabin itself. What the footage captured over weeks became quietly legendary. The bear and her cubs didn't just visit. They behaved differently. The bear would lie down in the grass, not to rest, but to listen. Her ears twitched to invisible sounds. She would rise only after long pauses, often lifting her nose toward the cabin, and then descend again into the woods. Tasha published nothing. She submitted no reports. She understood what she had seen, a line not to be crossed. She deleted the videos and left only a single note in her logbook. Some mourning cannot be measured. Some bonds transcend survival. By the end of autumn, the cubs were nearly grown. The visits grew less frequent. Winter crept back with its usual silence, blanketing the forest with a familiar hush. Then, one night, the anniversary of Amos' death, a storm rolled in. Not violent, but thick with snowfall. The kind of snow that bends branches and softens every sound. That night, she returned alone. No cubs. She walked the trail with slow steps. The cabin door had been gently bolted shut by Jonah that fall, and she did not force it open. Instead, she curled beside it. Snow drifted around her shoulders. She made no sound. The next morning, Jonah, feeling something he couldn't name, hiked up before sunrise. He found her there, still. Not asleep. Gone. The great bear had passed in her final visit, beneath the eaves of the only human home she had ever entered. The snow had formed a halo around her body. Her eyes were closed, her breath long since stilled. Jonah knelt, hands shaking, and wept without knowing why. The town agreed she would not be moved. She had chosen her resting place. So a memorial stone was carved. Nothing elaborate. Just a piece of river slate placed near the porch. On it, someone etched. She came when no one else did. She stayed when none dared. May she rest where she chose. The forest changed after that. Not in loud ways, not in magic or miracle. But something quieter. The trail to Amos' cabin remained clear, though no one cleared it. Wildflowers bloomed earlier. The foxes grew bolder, watching hikers from a distance but never running. And on still nights, the wind through the pines carried something softer. By spring, the cabin was reopened, not lived in, but cared for. Volunteers kept it from rotting. They stocked the shelves with Amos' favorite teas. They left the chair and the rug untouched. Visitors came from far and wide. Not to see a spectacle, but to sit on the porch and feel what had been. Some brought honey. Others brought poems. A few brought nothing at all but silence. And still, from time to time, a young bear, a daughter of that last great one, would appear. Not always. Not close. But visible enough to remind those watching that the story hadn't ended. It had become legend. It was deep winter again. The kind that silenced roads, hardened rivers, and curled smoke into the sky like forgotten prayers. The snow in the forest had piled high along the ridgelines, untouched and still. And on a quiet morning, where no wind dared stir, the world held its breath. No one had returned to the cabin since the man passed. His name had left the lips of most in the village, save for the old postman, who sometimes paused beside the frozen trailhead and tipped his cap toward the trees, like he remembered something worth remembering. But otherwise, time moved on. It always does. The forest, though, had not forgotten. Some mornings, the faintest trail of pawprints could be seen on the crusted snow leading up the slope. Others, claw marks on a tree that had once been fed under. Nothing that would draw attention to those who didn't know, but to the few who had witnessed that last winter, it meant everything. The bear, older now, her coat darker around the muzzle and eyes, still came. Not every day, not even every week. But often enough. Sometimes alone, sometimes with one or two of her grown cubs. They were strong and healthy, but they moved around her with a quiet reverence, as though they understood the silence the cabin now held. Inside, the cabin remained mostly untouched. A heavy layer of dust covered the furniture, and the hearth sat cold. On a small table by the window still stood a tin bowl, dented along one edge, the same one the man had always filled. The food was long gone, of course, but the bowl remained. The bear had looked for it once. Nudged it with her snout. Sat beside it for a while, then left. No human eye saw these things. But the forest noticed. The trees, the birds, the hush of the snowfall. Nature remembers in ways we don't understand. One day, many months after the funeral, a young woman with red hair and a thick scarf came walking up the trail. She looked uncertain, like someone revisiting a memory she wasn't sure was real. In her gloved hand, she carried an envelope. She pushed open the cabin door slowly, hesitating as if expecting to be met by the scent of pipe smoke and stew. But it was only musty and cold. Still, she stepped inside and stood in silence for a long time. On the mantel sat a faded photo, him, holding out a crust of bread toward a cautious, much younger bear. She smiled sadly. She pulled a letter from her coat, unfolded it. The ink was faded. Her grandfather's writing. Not addressed to her directly, but written with her in mind, she felt. They won't believe me, and that's fine. They never have. But every year she came, and every year I gave her what I could. Not because I was brave. Not because I was trying to tame anything. But because winter is long and lonely. And so was I. She didn't speak, but she listened better than anyone I've ever known. The girl tucked the letter back into her coat and stepped outside. She didn't know if the bear would come. She didn't even know if the bear was alive. She left a small parcel, bread, berries, and a handful of dried fish, by the edge of the porch. Then she sat on the old log near the woodshed and waited. It took hours. The sun was sinking low, fire-colored across the white snow. The woods were quiet. And then, crackling, not far off. Not loud. Not fast. Just steady. The girl held her breath. Through the trees came a dark shape. Towering, heavy, but slow. It paused at the clearing's edge. A massive brown bear, graying now, with years etched into her eyes. She looked at the parcel, then at the girl. Neither moved. Then, almost imperceptibly, the bear gave a huff, more exhale than growl, and lumbered toward the porch. The girl watched as the bear sniffed the package. Slowly, she began to eat. The girl said nothing. Just watched. Just listened to the quiet. She didn't want to touch the moment, didn't want to mark it with her own words. When the bear was finished, she sat down heavily in the snow, exactly where she had that last winter, beside the man's chair. It was too much for the girl. Tears fell down her cheeks before she could stop them. The bear turned her head slightly, watching her. Then, in one slow movement, she stood, walked to the side of the house, and disappeared into the woods. But she had come. And that was everything. Years passed. The cabin decayed. Trees leaned closer. Vines wrapped the porch. One of the windows broke in a spring storm, and no one came to fix it. But every winter, a small trail appeared in the snow. A careful path through the trees. Some years, there were 2 bears. Sometimes 1. Once, just a cub. They always stopped at the cabin. Sometimes, someone from the village would walk past and see tracks, or hear something large moving through the woods. They'd tell their families they'd seen the old bear from the stories. The one the recluse used to feed. The one that came back when he died. No one believed them, not really. But they liked the story. It made winter feel a little warmer. One summer, long after the cabin had collapsed and only the chimney remained standing, a young couple hiking the ridge found a strange sight, a smooth stone, flat and upright at the edge of a pine grove. It wasn't carved by machines, just etched by hand, weather-worn and cracked. But there were words still visible. He fed the bear every winter. On his deathbed, she returned one last time. The couple took a picture, shared it online. It made its way around, called a hoax by some, a legend by others. But somewhere deep in the woods, when the snow begins to fall and the forest folds in on itself like a closing book, you can still find the quiet pawprints near where the cabin used to be. And if you're lucky, if you're very still, and you believe even a little, you might catch a glimpse of a great old bear standing beside a stone. Waiting. The days after Eli's final encounter with the bear fell like snowflakes, soft at first, then heavier with each passing hour. The townspeople didn't know what to make of the rumors that the old man who had fed a wild bear for decades had been seen one last time in the woods, carried home by the very animal they'd warned him about for years. Some dismissed it as grief-distorting memory, others as fairy tale told by those too sentimental for their own good. But the house did not lie. The rocking chair on the porch sat eerily still now, no longer creaking to the rhythm of Eli's pipe-smoking ritual. The birdseed container hadn't been refilled. The chopped wood stack remained untouched, and the footprints of a massive animal led from the woods to the porch and back again, too fresh to be ignored, too large to be denied. It was Silas, the mailman, who first broke the unspoken hush. On his morning route, he stopped longer than usual, staring at the tracks. He took off his cap, ran a calloused hand over his graying beard, and muttered to himself, "Damn thing really came back." No one asked what he meant. Not directly. Because by now, the legend was beginning to solidify. The bear had returned. Not for food. Not for warmth. But for him. In the days that followed, something strange began to happen. People, especially those who had once scoffed, began leaving little things on Eli's porch. A candle. A bouquet of pine needles. A carving of a bear made by a child. Not as offerings to the bear, but to the memory of the man who had chosen compassion, year after year, in the silence of snowfall. Mrs. Langley, the retired schoolteacher who once called Eli out of his mind, came by with her grandson and sat on the steps where Eli used to hum his folk songs. She didn't speak much. Just looked at the woods, the rustling wind, and whispered, "I was wrong." There were others. The town pastor, once vocal about nature being wild and untamable, came too. He placed a small wooden cross on the railing, not for religion, but remembrance. And beside it, he set a carved salmon, hand-painted in crimson and gold. The forest, for its part, seemed quieter. As though it too mourned. Inside the house, where Eli's will had been tucked into the drawer beneath his journals, the lawyer and executor found more than expected. Detailed entries chronicling every winter visit. Sketches of the bear's changing coat. Descriptions of her eyes, how they aged. How she grew gentler, not more distant. A single line repeated at the bottom of many pages, she remembers. And in a weathered envelope, marked simply, for her, was a single, thick slice of dried salmon, sealed tight. No one dared move it. The executor, a pragmatic man by nature, cleared his throat. I think it stays. Winter began its slow fade. The days stretched longer. The light, once pale and timid, returned stronger, casting long golden beams through Eli's cabin windows. Yet the bear, she did not come back. Not right away. The townspeople waited. Or watched, rather. Every rustle of the trees, every fresh snowprint was met with quiet hope. But she was gone, like Eli. As if her final act had been to ensure he did not die alone. Spring broke fully in April. Wildflowers bloomed near the edge of the woods. And the birdsong returned with a kind of reverence, less chaotic, more harmonious. And then one dawn, nearly 5 months after Eli's passing, there she was. Large. Brown. Slower, perhaps. But unmistakably her. She came alone this time. No cubs. No audience. She walked, almost reverently, to the porch. Climbed 2 steps. Sat before the door that would no longer open. There was no salmon left. No fire in the hearth. No man in the chair. Only the quiet echo of what had been. And still, she stayed. Hours passed. A soft drizzle began to fall, turning the pine needles slick. She did not flinch. She did not pace. She merely sat, eyes half-lidded, head turned slightly toward the woods, as if listening for a tune she knew would never be sung again. The boy, young Jacob, the carpenter's son, was the one who finally approached. Barefoot, careful, with the same ginger steps Eli had once taken. He held out a fresh trout, caught from the creek that morning. She did not move. He placed it gently on the porch beside her, nodded once, and backed away. Later, when asked what compelled him, Jacob simply said, it didn't feel right, her being empty-handed. The bear eventually left as quietly as she came. But not before nudging the trout once with her nose. Not before lifting her head and gazing at the empty rocker as if expecting it to move. And in the months that followed, she returned. Not daily. Not even monthly. But often enough that the town stopped wondering if it was real. It was real. So real, in fact, that a small wooden sign now hangs from Eli's front porch. In memory of the man who remembered her. The cabin was never sold. No one would touch it. It became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Not for tourism, not for profit, but for reflection. Children learned the story not through books, but through whispered walks with their parents. Couples sat on the porch in silence, holding hands, touched by a story that was somehow more than myth but not quite history. And deep in the woods, the bear aged. Her visits grew less frequent. Her steps more labored. But every year, like clockwork, just after the first true snow of the season, she came. Once, she came with a limp. Another time, with a smaller cub trailing behind her. But always, always, she came. And each time, someone in the town would notice and leave something small, a salmon, a carved heart, a little blanket stitched with pine trees. Because they remembered. And in their remembering, the line between man and animal blurred. Eli's legacy wasn't just in his kindness to a creature of the forest. It was in his unwavering belief that connection was possible across species, across silence, across time. In his final winter, she returned for him. In every winter since, the town returned for her. Winter's second breath came colder than its first, sweeping down from the mountains and through the hollows like a hand searching for memories buried under snow. The cabin sat quieter now. What little life it had once echoed, boot steps, kettle whistles, laughter lost to solitude, seemed now only to reside in the wood itself. The man's chair remained by the window, but the body that once warmed it had left weeks ago. The townspeople who came up the trail to pay final respects found the place just as he'd left it. A pot still hanging over the cold hearth, books open to pages with thumb-worn corners, the smell of cedar and tobacco faint in the rafters. But they didn't linger. They never did. Not out of fear, but reverence, like stepping into a church not your own. They left his cabin undisturbed, save for the trail of footprints leading to and from the grave marker near the base of the large pine. And yet, the snow around that grave never stayed untouched for long. Every few nights, under moonlight sharp enough to split silence, a dark shape would appear, massive, slow, solemn. The bear. She came not with hunger or rage but with something harder to name. She would sit by the stone for hours, unmoving, save for the slow shift of breath. Two cubs, smaller still but growing, trailed behind her like living echoes, curling beside her when she finally lay down. No one in town believed it until they saw it. And even then, they whispered about it like a miracle you dare not disturb. One teenager took a photo on a borrowed camera. It made it into the newspaper, The Bear Who Mourns the Man. But the editor pulled it a day later. It didn't feel right, he said. Some stories you don't sell. Some grief you just let be. The local schoolteacher, a woman with silver hair and a voice like linen, began taking her students to the edge of the woods once a week. They would bring pine cones, carved tokens, and old apples, placing them gently beneath the tree. She called it the remembering place. Not a shrine, not a zoo, just a spot where a man and a bear had once shared winters, and perhaps still did, in the way that time stretches itself around bonds deeper than words. One day, the teacher found a folded paper on the bench near the trail. It was stained with snowmelt, but the writing was legible, careful, uneven, like a hand that hadn't held a pen in years. I fed her because she was hungry. She stayed because I was alone. Now, I am gone. But she remembers. And that is enough. No one ever claimed it. No one had to. Elsewhere, the cubs grew bolder. One was particularly curious, a male, with a lighter patch on his right shoulder. He'd sniff the edges of town on moonless nights, knocking over compost bins but never harming anyone. He once walked straight up to the schoolhouse and pawed at the door. The teacher opened it slowly, unsure of what she expected. The bear stood there, blinking, then turned and ambled away. The children, watching through frosted glass, said nothing, but in the silence, something sacred passed between the wild and the learned. As spring crept in again, timid at first, then bold with melting rivers, the grave marker remained untouched by weeds. Someone always seemed to clear it. Maybe the wind. Maybe the bear. Maybe the town itself had begun to care for the man in ways he never imagined when alive. There was talk of turning the cabin into a historical site. A small plaque, perhaps. Something quiet. Not a tourist stop, but a place of stillness. The mayor proposed it in a town hall meeting and was met with nods. Not approval, necessarily, but acknowledgement. This place meant something now. Something lasting. But when a small group finally hiked up with tools and a frame for the plaque, they found the cabin changed. It wasn't damaged. Nothing broken. But it looked lived in. Fresh pine boughs at the entrance. Scratches on the door, not of aggression, but of entry. Inside, a new stack of firewood rested beside the hearth. And in the center of the room, atop the man's old coat, lay a single feather. Raven black, curved and shining in the slant of light. Not the work of animals. Not the work of humans, either. The crew left without nailing a single board. No plaque was ever placed. The cabin remained as it was, its story passed down, whispered and re-whispered by those who had seen the bear with their own eyes, or whose parents had. Over time, details blurred. Was it one winter or many? Did the bear really cry that night he passed? Were there really letters left behind? But one truth endured. That winter after he died, the bear came. And every year since, she came again. The morning after the storm broke, the world outside was so silent that it almost seemed wrong. Snow blanketed everything in a thick, undisturbed sheet of white, muting every sound and softening every sharp edge. The cabin creaked as it settled in the cold, and inside, the old man stirred in his bed, barely more than a whisper beneath the layers of wool that wrapped around his failing body. He blinked slowly, his vision clouded more by memory than cataracts, and waited. Outside, pawprints led from the woods to his porch, then to the door, and stopped. For hours, they remained there, as if time itself had chosen not to disturb the delicate pattern. The bear did not knock. She did not need to. Her presence was louder than sound. That morning, for the first time in days, the old man asked for the curtains to be drawn back. The nurse hesitated. But he insisted, voice barely audible. And when the heavy wool was lifted from the window's edge, the winter sun broke through like a holy beam, illuminating the glass with golden light. And there she was. Sitting just beyond the porch, not close, not far. The same brown bear. Older, thicker around the neck, grayer around the muzzle, but unmistakable. Her massive form was still, her breath a rhythmic cloud in the air. And beside her, nestled against her side, were two cubs. They too sat in silence, watching the cabin, the window, the old man. Tears did not come easily to him anymore. His body did not weep the way it once had. But something behind his ribs twisted in a way that was so ancient, so raw, it bypassed tears entirely. His lips parted in a smile that cracked dry skin. His fingers, curled and stiff, twitched forward, as if reaching through the glass. She came, he whispered. The nurse, standing at his side, didn't know what to say. She'd seen the photographs. Heard the stories. Thought them lovely but exaggerated, like all local folklore. But now, staring into the eyes of the bear that waited outside, she knew the truth sat here, breathing, solid, undeniable. The old man didn't move again for a long while. He simply watched. Outside, the bear did the same. Her eyes, so wild, yet calm, did not leave the window. In that stillness, memories returned, not in fragments but in waves. He remembered the first time he saw her as a cub, starving and frostbitten, her ribs poking through matted fur. How she'd collapsed at the edge of his woodshed, too weak to growl. How he'd stood there, bucket of fish scraps in one hand, axe in the other, unsure which he'd need. He chose the bucket. Every winter since, she'd returned. She grew bold, then trusting. She never ventured too close unless invited, never growled, never stole. Over time, he no longer left food in a pan, he placed it on the porch railing, then finally by the door. And one year, she came with a scar above her eye, and he knew she'd survived something big. He felt honored that she had returned at all. And now, this final visit. It wasn't a coincidence. He felt it in his bones, the same way the earth knew when to sleep under snow or stretch toward sun. The nurse left the room quietly. She made herself small, invisible. Outside, she watched through the kitchen window as the bear lay down, still facing the cabin, curling her massive body around her cubs. The man dozed. Not deeply. Just enough to let his body loosen, for pain to fade. In his dream, or maybe not a dream at all, he stood outside on the porch, no cane, no blanket, just his old boots and a flannel jacket. The snow didn't chill him. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke. The bear was there, as always. He held out a hand, low and unthreatening. She lumbered closer, slow and sure. The cubs stayed back. And then, for the first time, she pressed her muzzle gently into his palm. He exhaled. The next morning, the nurse opened the window. The bear was gone. The paw prints were there, now half filled with snow. The cubs' smaller tracks wandered briefly before rejoining their mother's path into the trees. Inside the cabin, the old man lay still, eyes closed, face at peace. His hand rested by his side, fingers slightly curled, as if recently holding something. The townspeople said they saw a bear with 2 cubs heading west. Some said they'd seen her before. The ranger confirmed that yes, a large brown bear had been spotted for over a decade in these parts, always alone. A gentle one, by all accounts. The nurse didn't share the full story. But she took a photograph, the old man's final portrait, sunlight on his face, and placed it on the mantel. Beneath it, she carved something into the old hearthstone. Fed the bear. Kept the peace. Years passed. The cabin became part of local lore. Some hikers swore they saw a bear watching them from the trees, never approaching, always calm. One spring, a boy camping near the old place said a bear left him a fish by the fire pit. No one believed him, except the nurse. And one day, a granddaughter came, no older than 10, red scarf and mittens too big for her hands. She stood at the old marker stone beside the trail where the memorial now sat, reading the inscription carved deep into granite. She didn't fully understand it yet. But the wind blew, and in it, she swore she heard a low, gentle rumble, like a greeting. Or maybe a goodbye. The wind rustled softly through the pines, gentler now than in years past, as if the forest itself had exhaled. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the dark, wet earth beneath, rich with the smell of coming life. Around the old cabin, now a silent husk of memory, the trees seemed taller, older, as if they'd kept watch longer than anyone could remember. Years had passed since the day the bear had come down from the ridge with her cubs, and years since she had returned to find the man gone. Seasons circled like tired constellations. Time had softened the sharpest memories into something warmer, something more sacred. In the nearby town, the man's name had almost vanished. His old truck sat rusting by the shed, the cabin falling into gentle decay. But there were still signs, subtle ones. A makeshift cross nailed high to a pine tree. A weathered plaque in the library that read only, "To the one who remembered how to give." And in the stories whispered to children before bed, of a man who fed the wild and received something far greater in return. The bear hadn't been seen in 2 winters now. Locals said she must have moved on, taken her cubs farther up the mountain or perhaps succumbed to age or hunger. But a few believed otherwise, that she remained, watching from the tree-line, too clever and too wild to be glimpsed easily. The forest, though, remembered everything. A young biologist, fresh out of university and wide-eyed, trekked through that forest one day, drawn by rumors of unusually gentle bear activity in the valley. She pitched her tent near the ridge and kept notes. Day after day, she sat with her thermos, listening. At night she'd hear movement in the underbrush. Once, she caught a glimpse, a shadow too large to be a deer, too silent to be a moose. She found the cabin by accident, half sunken in snow, shrouded in moss. Inside, the remains of a stove, an old coat hanging by the door, and on a table, a tin plate with a spoon still resting in its hollow. The dust of many winters lay like ash over everything. But outside, the most curious thing, an open, clear patch of snow, disturbed by what looked like claw marks, not frenzied or threatening, but deliberate, circular. Like something had sat. Watched. Waited. That night, as the biologist scribbled in her journal, she wrote, "There's something here, something old. Not just wildlife patterns or migration tracks, but story. A presence. It feels like the woods are holding their breath around me." On her final morning, she woke before dawn and found her thermos missing. In its place, a piece of wood, carefully shaved and shaped into the form of a paw. Not carved by any man, but worn naturally, perhaps over years, by water or weather or something else. She tucked it into her bag and left the forest slower than she entered it, her heart stretched quietly into some new shape. Back in the woods, the bear, older now, slower, stood by the cabin once more. Her coat had grayed, her movements more deliberate. She sniffed the air, catching something faint and comforting, bacon grease, tobacco, pine sap, and a long-departed heartbeat. She circled the porch once, then lay down, just as she had years ago, her breathing heavy but unafraid. Above her, in the trees, the wind moved like a lullaby. And from somewhere just beyond sight, the man watched, not as flesh, not quite as spirit, but as memory itself. He had long been part of the land now, stitched into the moss and the bark, into the claws of cubs and the silence between snowfall. If anyone had listened closely that morning, they might have heard a sound too soft for the waking world, not growl or echo or breeze, but gratitude. Because some stories do not end. They settle. They become forest. They become bear. They become home.